welcome to today's episode of what we can now call Dealroom video podcast.
Yeah.
Since it's the second episode, means that it is regular, which means that it is now a podcast. So congratulations with being on a podcast, guys. So unlike the previous one, let's just do a little bit of in the way of an introduction. So we are here with Yoram. Yoram, just 2 words about yourself.
Founder and CEO of Dealroom.
Perfect. And Lorenzo?
Yeah, head of research at Dealroom, so taking care of the content, insights, and planning of how to make value out of our data at Dealroom.
Perfect. And my name is Andrii Degeler. I am a journalist at unzip.media. So we are here at Dealroom headquarters, and the idea of the podcast is to talk about things that Dealroom has a lot of data on. Right? And so we want to sit down in these videos and dig deeper into different questions that data can give answers to. And today's topic is energy tech, and it is a little bit connected to the energy tech briefing that will be happening a bit later today with Lorenzo and Orla Brown. But for now, it is the 3 of us to go through the data that we have so far to answer what kind of questions are we actually answering. Guys, what would be the main question that you think these data can answer?
I think energy is a huge topic in Europe right now, and energy independence. I think every country in the world would love to have energy independence, but Europe seems especially vulnerable. So there's a lot of talk. It seems all to be like, people have strong opinions, but maybe not a lot of data. So I would be interested to explore, can Europe become energy self-sufficient? And also, actually, I think Lorenzo is going to show that this is not unique to Europe, that actually most of the world is highly dependent on other countries that they don't really like that much.
Yeah, I think we figured that out over the past few years already, somewhat. Okay, so Lorenzo, can you just start then and walk us through the data that you've got, and if you have any questions that you think this is answering, you can also talk about that.
No, sure. So what Yoram said, so we're gonna start a bit generally on what's happening in energy. Just global trends, so not specifically to startup or innovation per se, but generally about energy. And then we're gonna look a bit more closer at the startup and venture capital ecosystem. So there's gonna be a bit of an umbrella because of course energy is a huge topic. So these are some of the attendees that we will discuss with later, and there's all kind of things from big corporates to investor to startup.
Everyone is interested.
So it's an interesting topic for sure. So what we start from is a bit of an intro on what we call a new energy system that's been cooking up for the past decade and now is taking momentum. And then this new huge attention to energy resilience, energy security, and whatever we want to call this, which is not something new, but especially in Europe is really taking up a lot of the attention at the moment. So of course, many people question, is there even a transition? So still not fully, in the sense that in last year, over 50% of new energy was still fossil fuel. So maybe one could see this and say, okay, we're really far, nothing is changing. But actually a lot is changing because electricity is growing a lot more. So this means that we are electrifying things. So what was before directly fossil fuel, a car that uses oil or your house that uses gas, is now becoming slowly, but becoming electrified. So then if you clean up how you generate electricity, you replace both of these things, basically. So instead, if we don't look at all of energy, because it's a bit tricky to compare fossil fuel with renewable, nuclear, or whatever there. But if we look at all the electricity, then the change has already pretty much happened. Because last year it was over 80% clean, renewable and nuclear, solar, wind, hydro, and so on. So there, fossil fuel are almost on the way to extinction. And this is going pretty fast.
And this is the new, the
new, of course. So it takes, energy doesn't change 1 year to the other. It's not digital. It's not it takes decades to build. So it's not gonna change like from 1 second to the other. But also people tend to think, okay, it's new, so then everything that's there is not gonna change. That's wrong, because plants get decommissioned when they're too old, or they get used less. So in China, for instance, everyone says there's a lot of coal, but some of that is being used less each year. So even if they don't destroy it because they might need it for one day or whatever, they use it less, and so that's also changing.
So you mean that basically, like when one coal plant sort of being decommissioned, doesn't mean that a new coal plant is being built in its
and it's
place.
Also maybe it is not officially decommissioned. It was used 60% of the time. Now it's used 40, and this actually makes sense, because most of the cost in running everything that is with gas or coal or whatever is the fuel. So it's not mostly building it, but it's mostly operating it. So in theory, what China, for instance, is doing is they have a lot of these plants, and then they use it how much they need, So that's been their approach. And in future, they plan to use it less and less. Maybe they still have the same amount, but they use it less and less. So that's things are changing, and it was now in total. Clean energy is 40% of electricity generation, so that's quite a lot. And actually, it's funny because for some decades it was completely flat, and this is because hydro and nuclear especially were decreasing, and then the new guys are solar and wind that has been growing crazily faster in the last few years. So that's
historically it seems a pretty rapid.
So they accounted for most of the generation in the last year. So that's what's been happening. And of course now there's a lot of talk about will we see a nuclear resurgence, and so that's all to be seen. But for now, nuclear has been losing importance in the last 20 years globally. So there was a lot built in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then it kind of stopped being built almost globally.
Yeah, because you just showed before we were recording France.
France pretty much built all the reactors between the 70s and the 90s. So they had like 4% of nuclear in the 70s, and they had like over 70% in the 90s. So in those 20 years, they built almost everything they have to. Then they kept on building a few, but that was the big build out. So it shows that when you get on something very focused for, whatever reason, geopolitical, energy security, whatever, in 2 decades you can do a lot. Maybe, you can do more cheaply with one source or the other. So that's, things are changing. But yeah, these transitions sometimes happen pretty fast,
Do you actually know why France was so motivated to do this?
I think nuclear is very related to other topics. So, like kind of also the defense side, being more independent in some way. So France has been, in Europe, the country that always kept more important in being kind of independent, integrated in Europe, but like we want to not depend on the US or someone else for anything. So also in defense, they never really totally integrated. In energy, so I guess they kept their nuclear stock also militarily. So probably the two things often go together. That's why there's a lot of people also against nuclear, because they fear that when you build more nuclear plants, then you also deploy more nuclear weapons, and these two things have some connection, not always. So there's a bit of this reason, that probably France was the one that really decided to go this way. But it's not that France is without any problem. They had problem in the last few years. Some of these reactors getting old. They don't have enough water. Electricity is cheap, but it's not the cheapest one out there. So it's not like they figured everything out, but they have it worked out for them so far, Yeah, and so then the narrative is, we saw this also from the startup perspective, that everyone was talking about, clean, renewable emission and so on. And now everything is security, resilience, cost. Grid and the stability, but the kind of the things that are getting built are the same, renewable, nuclear, geothermal, hydrogen, batteries, grid technology, those stuff, they have been changing a bit, of course, but it's not like it's different stuff. The solutions are the same for both problems, basically.
But it feels like now there's a whole lot more urgency, at least if you just listen to the conversations.
Yeah.
The entire clean energy and renewable and emission ideas were not getting as much traction, it seems, as the security and resilience ones.
Yeah, we will see how that... So like in Europe, where we are from at the moment, like this urgency, of course, was... The wake-up call was the Russia invasion of Ukraine, of course. That meant that, from one day to the other, they figured out that getting, hooked up totally on gas from Russia maybe was not the safest choice, basically. So that was when it started seriously. And then now with the new also relation with because that dependency of Russia, then it became a bit more of a dependency on the US, on natural gas from the US. So now also with the relationship with the US being a bit less, relaxed than in the past few decades, then that is also coming into the narrative. So in general, the problem with being dependent with fossil fuel imports is that, and most countries in the world actually are dependent on imports of fossil fuel, is that if they stop one day, the next day you cannot move your car, you cannot, turn the light in your house, and it's really like you can have a bit of safe reserves, but they cannot last a lot. So you are really dependent on a continuous flow, and that's it. So if anything happens geopolitically, you're really at risk.
Yes.
So most of the world, and it's all of Europe basically, mostly.
Yeah, so the red countries are the ones that are...
they are more insecure.
They're dependent in terms of importing fossil fuels.
Yeah, importing everything, can be gas, oil, coal, or whatever.
As part of their total energy demand.
Yeah, so also China and India are dependent. China's been doing a lot to reduce the dependency. They have a lot of coal, but they have zero oil or gas almost. So everything that they can replace oil and gas with, they try to do it. And Europe, of course, is dependent on oil and gas. And with gas, things have been changing a lot. Europe has decreased a lot their gas imports, but still there's a lot more to be done. And with oil, it's mostly about cars and the kind of mobility space, but there's other things.
So China is making these massive investments in nuclear and solar and everything, and batteries, also because of energy security.
Yeah. They figured out like 20-something years ago is when things really started that they were importing a lot of this. And so what they have domestically is coal, and what they can build, because you don't need to have something to mine or whatever, is we can build solar, we can build wind, we can build electric vehicles and this kind of stuff. And all of those are something that we can have domestically. We stop the reliance on everything else. There were other reasons or whatever, but for sure this is a strong reason that they have to do what they're doing. And Europe has been kind of a bit doing the same, but probably with less long-term vision and less consistency. Every time, every few years, there's a bit less momentum, more momentum, and so on. So Germany invented solar, but then they didn't believe in it until the very end, and they got crushed by China and so on. And we were a bit more hesitant maybe in doing some stuff, basically. And of course, when we look at... Actually, Europe we are really unlucky, honestly, because also in renewables we have enough of them in theory to build a system, but we also have a lot less than other countries because we are small, basically. And
on this slide, it looks almost like we're singled out.
It's the most unlikely region for energy systems. So there's a lot of work to be done in Europe.
I thought Spain would have been darker. Like they have like some desert in the middle.
Yeah, they have a lot of solar, yes, but it's very densely populated, Europe. when you actually...
Iceland has thermal...
of course. I think they're fine, honestly.
Yeah, but for instance, in Africa, Kenya has a lot of geothermal, and they have a lot of generation on that, and they figured out their electricity generation there. So it's sometimes, all of Africa has more than enough. You can do whatever. They can be a powerhouse on this in theory if they figure out the political and everything, of course. The Middle East has both, fossil fuel and a lot of renewable. They just building the biggest solar and battery plant in Abu Dhabi, and they're doing because they have a lot of potential there, and why not? So they're not like ideologically against everything that is clean or renewable. They just do whatever is good for business, basically, and that makes sense. But yeah, in Europe we have to figure out a lot of things, and it's not easy anyway to build a completely independent energy system, for sure.
And what is this thing here on the right?
Yeah, that most of the population lives in a country where you have enough renewables to do, in theory, a system. So then it doesn't mean that it's the most effective to do 100% or whatever. So that's very dependent where you are, but there's no country that you need to be really reliant. Maybe you buy batteries from China, but anyway, once you buy a battery, it's there, and for 30 years it works. And if China decides they're not going to sell you any battery, you still have it. And maybe you need to figure out where you buy the next one, but it doesn't happen that you don't have energy the next day. So that's the difference between being reliant on fossil fuel and being reliant on something else, battery, wind, solar, that is a system, then it operates 20, 30 years without stop. Still, it's good if we build something. So we need to start building something again, of course, in Europe, in the US. That's what this moment is also about. But it's a different kind of dependency,
right?
Politically.
Like maybe in 30 years, we'll have all these old Chinese batteries, like Cuba now has these old American cars.
Yeah, they can last a pretty long time, yeah. And actually, of course, China has been investing a lot more than everyone else into this. They really believed in that they can create a new energy system, and they can create a lot of value out of that. Like 1/4 of their GDP growth is from this sector. They are certainly winning in this space. Europe has been actually doing almost the global average. So we're not like overdoing anything. Actually, there's a narrative that, Europe has been really, doing the most and we are killing ourselves, but it's not that we are doing so much more than the others. And of course, United States have a different incentive. Like they are the biggest fossil fuel exporter in the world. So they have less of a motive to change in some way. There's of course all the climate change and problem side of things, but from a economical, geopolitical perspective, they can keep going as they are because it's been working out well for them with fracking and so on.
So Europe already spends almost 2% on energy transition, and this goes into.
Yeah, I think that includes kind of everything, that you spend in the energy system, basically. But yeah, something around that, yeah.
Pretty interesting. And China is doing more than double.
In share of GDP, so in total amount, it's
even more, I guess.
Yeah, depends how you if you decide nominal or non-nominal GDP. But yeah, it's doing also on an absolute scale more. Yeah.
Yeah. Because they're especially motivated to just be completely independent.
They also just figure out that they could win a totally new market. Like for instance, in automotive, they had figured out that they could never compete with Europe and the US because they lacked 100 years of invention and know-how on how to do engines that are super complex or things. And then they saw actually, at the first Tesla in the US, and they said, oh, maybe, these cars can be the future. And no one already has them, so we can be the one doing them. Yeah. And they just, won a market there. And then they have a lot of, they had a good planning. They have a lot of, workforce. They're actually being, pretty good in developing technology today. So they just decided we are going to win batteries, we're going to win solar, because that's a huge market. And if we crush every other competition, then everything is on us,
Yeah.
And the bet is, even if actually I think the United States is like a very marginal market for export of this stuff for China. Europe is a good one, but the rest of the world is a huge market also. Every country, Africa, South East Asia, Latin America, all these countries, they are torn between, the US that pushes them to adopt fossil fuel and China that pushes them to buy, solar and so on. And they got to figure out what's best for them, of course. So it's kind of a bit like this also power struggling going about. And it's a new market, and usually if you can position yourself as a winner in a new market, then it's a good bet for the long term. And so China is dominating, from the research side, manufacturing, deploying. This is instead looking at what's just pushed by economics and what's more dependent on policies in a bit. So what you see not dotted is what happens if there's not a lot of political will, and it just kind of follows basic economics or things like that. So solar batteries, they don't really need you to love them because they are getting very cheap and very easy to deploy and everything. So they're going to grow anyway. They can grow a bit more or a bit less depending, what countries decide to do and so on. But other topics are very dependent. So nuclear, of course, like at the moment is kind of, if we follow economics, it's not going to grow much. But if we follow there's kind of political will or for, security reasons, or you decide that you want to bet on nuclear, then this can change. Also, EVs can change a lot if there's a push or not, because adoption it's getting fast, but it's still dependent, and there's some market that might never exist at all.
Yeah, with the EVs, that's basically whether a country would or would not ban, for example, the sale of new
I think
cars that are
the
not
ban
EV.
is often just it's not making really a difference. It's more for planning. If things keep growing, then in 10 years maybe you sell 5% of IC car, or you sell 0. That's not a huge difference. It's more like telling, in 10 years we're going to be there. And then when we get to actual financing to startups.
Before you get into this, so because, actually on financing, because normally, Dealroom covers venture capital, startups, and traditionally energy finance is real estate, project finance, totally different kind of financing. So when we talk about energy tech, we're not talking about buildings, obviously, or even machinery that's been in existence. What are we really talking about?
Yeah, so we talk, of course, about new technological developments. So the stuff that are a bit more far from the market. So we talk about nuclear, we talk about some battery chemistry, things like this that are being developed. That's, just, money that go into this development, into building this market and so on. There's also a bit that, of course, is around just deployment. So we are talking about equity mostly, but also not equity that goes to these new players, new startups. We are not talking about the big solar farms that are just being developed. That is very mature technology. So also if a startup is building a new plan to build a sustainable aviation fuel with synthetic fuel whatsoever, if these things are maybe the first, they're called first of a kind plants. And those are really a bit more high risk. So there is project development, but it's not fully commercial and something, standardized in the market. Those we cover because usually new developments. But if you just build a basic solar plant today, then you just raise some very safe kind of capital from banks, and it's not the focus of what we're going to discuss. So there's some project financing also in here, but it's for these new kind of things. when you build something that is not yet default, basically.
And if one of those new things becomes highly successful, then they would probably at some point also need a lot of project finance.
Yeah. Usually, especially in these sectors, after a while, you stop raising equity, usually, or very little, because it's very costly. Equity is in theory, the most costly way to finance yourself. It's just that for new things, then it has a big upside for who invests in you, so it can take more risk, while if you go to a bank, they're not going to finance you to do something totally new at the beginning. So the objective for energy tech is at a certain point to go to banks and then just get that loan for 2%, 3% of return and just build a lot of plants with that in the long term. But you have to get there. You have to deploy the first plants, show that it works, and so on.
Do you think there's a need for some kind of hybrid between kind of when we're kind of on the cusp of becoming really like scalable?
Large scale.
There's like a lot of nuances of different kind of financing around climate tech and energy tech. So there's a lot of different kind of debts, more high risk, less high risk, that can bridge to that point. So already today, startups are raising some equity, some debt that is a bit more high risk from different commercial banks or public entities or so on. There's a bit of grants. They're getting creative with the financing stack. And let's say not all debt is the same, how much you need to repay, like the percentage that they charge is very different depending on risk. So there's instrument of financing for this, but it's a stuff that's been coming up in the last few years. So it's not everyone is familiar. It's not a fully settled ecosystem, and things change. So some players are taking more risk. Some PE or infrastructure players are more at their comfort with also getting their hand dirty with more risky stuff. Others tend to back more mature technology. So there's a lot of movement in the ecosystem like that, so they are not getting only equity, but sometimes you still need to raise a lot of equity to try this stuff out, basically, today.
What role does the VC then play in the entire energy transition, if we can call it that?
So VC is born in theory to back stuff at the very early stage and with high risk. So that's still, mostly work of the VCs, also in energy tech. And this can be new hardware, deep tech, whatever. It can also be some software, SaaS models. So there's a lot in there in flexibility, grid management, adoption of some of this technology, installation of solar, selling solar. So there's a lot of things also there. So of course, the first money you get are usually from, risk capital, so venture capital or adjacent. And then it depends at which point you kind of stop or change a bit your stack. And we see sometimes billions of funding raised still from equity. So it's, some people don't like to call it venture capital. It's still, some kind of equity financing to a private, new company. So whatever is a mix of VC and PE, whatever, it's still equity. So there's still big raises like this in energy tech, but they're more and more often coupled with other types of financing. So maybe you go at 30%, 30% of more like grants, 30% of debt, 30% of equity. It depends what stage you are. So at a certain point, it's hard to build a lot of plants just on equity. So it's not gonna work out for you at a certain point. So at a certain point, venture capital gets less relevant or just a piece of the game, basically.
But it's still rather important.
Yeah, it's still rather important. It's not the only way, of course, but especially in the outside of maybe China, is the way that new stuff are getting built the most. So almost everything is coming up from there. There's, of course, energy is still a game where there's big corporates, but to develop a new battery chemistry, you usually start from there. There's the only capital you can get.
Right. Okay, show us the data.
So I think when we look at world climate tech, now the energy is the first big boss of this like blue color. And so in the last, 4 or 5 years, it's gotten a lot more of the share of climate tech. So the attention has moved a lot from topics like transportation, food that were also attracting a lot to energy has been really rising up the ranks. And when we talk about energy, it's a lot of stuff. So there's renewables mostly around solar because there's a lot more also commercial, residential utility. There's more things to be built there in terms of startup, but there's a lot in nuclear that is still, a huge sector and it's getting momentum. There's grid technology. There's stationary energy storage batteries for both short-term and long-term. There's hydrogen and other green molecules. All of these things are big topics in the venture capital space. So here we are looking at the equity side, the really venture capital. So these are the topics that have been dominating the landscape in the last few years.
And what's the difference between utility and commercial solar?
Utility is like a big factory farm of solar, the huge plants that you build somewhere far. Commercial is more like if you have a building of an industry or real estate, and it's not like just a consumer residential type of things. Yeah.
And where would and the blue stationary energy, those are batteries.
Yeah, batteries more for like, because there's battery also for electric vehicles. The lines are blurry between the two, but it's like only the ones that have most of their attention to the stationary space. This is a huge market, but it's still not dominated by startups in the deployment.
Exactly.
But there's a lot of work that is being done still there, mostly on the alternatives, basically.
And what is a really, because solar seems like, what is the really kind of frontier stuff happening in solar?
Most of it is not like deep technology. Most is like aiding the deployment or getting it, to scale. So sometimes it's the adoption stuff, loans, or even fintech marketplaces or SaaS that are around it. Yeah. There's a bit of development in some stuff like perovskite panel, but it's not a huge portion yet. So it's not really there's not like a lot of deep technology being built there. It's more like market adoption and business model and things like that are getting there. Yeah. And if we look at energy tech, then what's been happening globally in the last decade. There's of course some cooling down of funding from the last 3 years, 2021 to 2023, that were really crazy year for venture capital in general in all sectors. But it's still up like almost 40% in the last 4 years. So it's still a growing, market, still a lot of activity. And this, of course, differs a bit by stages. Most of the decrease has been at the late stage. Most of this, like a bit of missing some huge mega rounds. And there's still a good amount of activity at early breakout stage. So there's new startup coming out, even if there's a decrease a bit on all of the stages. So the market has been cooling down a bit. We see more impact still at the late stage, but also the early stage is getting it.
Like what's happened to mega rounds? Is money not coming? Are these startups just or scale ups at that point? Are they finding money elsewhere? What's going on there?
It's a mix. Like maybe it was also a bit excessive a few years back, especially because they're like we said, there's diversification, so it's becoming more and more not just equity, and we can see that later. So it's a mix of these things, and of course capital is more costly, and so in general it's hard to raise 1-2 billion or whatever today in the market that we have if you're not an AI company. Of course for energy this has been impacting a bit the late stage. There's still a lot of money that is going there, and actually what's probably a bit surprising for many people is that the US has been getting most of the money in the start of 2025 in the energy tech sector. So despite everything that is happening there, they're betting a lot on the innovation and startup space there. We are going to see, of course, more in the coming months what really happens, because there's always it takes months to close a deal, and it takes months to announce it. So maybe, end of year, we're going to see better what's really the impact of all of what's happening. But it's still, and actually Europe had overcome the US briefly in 2023, but then it's actually been dropping quite a bit, the financing. So it can be a bit surprising. Of course, and the US is actually having a pretty strong quarter in Q1. So if we exclude the crazy years, it's actually, and a lot of this is going into sectors that are less politically, also debated. So there's a lot of nuclear fission and fusion. There's AI for mineral discovery. There's grid tech. There's green molecules. So some of this stuff a lot of this is not like on what most of the discussion is about. So it also makes sense that it's just more of an ecosystem betting on this kind of venture capital and startups. So there's still momentum in some of these topics. And if we look on the global scale, some of the segments that have been growing the most in the recent years is for sure around batteries, around hydrogen, around some of these topics, while the one that got the most financing is it's more mature segment like electric mobility, solar energy. Of course, there the growth is a bit less and it's becoming more of a commercial scale thing. And when we look at who's like kind of leading on what, Europe is, and this is all in the lens of like more VC funding. So China is not really well represented because they have a different system to do these things. But like between mostly Europe and the US.
Yeah, it's mostly the comparison between Europe and the US.
It's mostly between those two. Like Europe is really strong in things like smart grid tech, even with what happened in Spain recently, EV charging and some of these topics, while the US is definitely the leader in topics like nuclear, geothermal, for some reason, and so this is like, there are a bit of regional differences, of course, in how the energy system is developing and where the bets are really being made. Yeah, and then we have a few deep dives, like mostly around the energy and AI and the generation side and grid and batteries.
That's good fun.
Yeah, so I think everyone needs to be an AI expert to discuss with people these days.
But aren't we all though?
Yeah, I think every one of us has been studying. So we put together a couple of things. So I think people have in mind that everyone is talking about an explosion of demand coming from AI. And usually prediction are like, it's really hard to predict the future, otherwise we'll all be rich by investing. But for sure, we can reasonably expect that there's going to be quite some increase in demand from electricity from AI data centers. So in some cases, they say that it's going to be in the US 12% of the total electricity demand in 2030. That could be quite a lot, especially because like for many years, there wasn't like a huge growth in demand in Europe and the US. Like the demand has been in China, in emerging economies, but in Europe and the US, like maybe for 20 years, demand was kind of almost flat or growing very little. And now we have to figure out how we are gonna step it up. So that's more of what's also the debate. But there could be a lot of demand coming out. It totally depends on adoption, how crazy gets, how model become good, or so on. If we look at the decade between 2010 2020, internet traffic, everyone was saying, internet is gonna blow up energy demand. Everything we do going offline, this is gonna, require a lot of energy, and it didn't require more energy at all.
Why?
Because I like to say that it's digital stuff. And in digital, you can actually have a lot that you can do. You can have, a lot of efficiency in just how you manage these bits in all the parts of the system. A lot of of credit goes to data center themselves. They become much more efficient also in how they cool themselves and how they do things. But it's also just how you manage this traffic, this computing and everything, you have huge gains that you can have there. So also in AI, we can have an algorithm that is 10 times more efficient and just deploy that. And we don't know where is the limit. While if you want to make more efficient your boiler at home, you cannot get 10 times more. You can get 10%, but not 10 times. There's physics, like the physics limits are pretty hard to break. So usually you have to change your system. So you go and you put an 8 pump and get a boiler. In digital, you can change your algorithm. Maybe you get 50% less demand, and then you change the connector in a data center, you get another 50%. So it's more about realizing is the demand for computing gonna grow 100 times, then also the efficiency is hard to catch up. But we don't know what's gonna happen.
There's reversible computing coming.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff.
You actually did a report on.
Yeah, we did a report with World Fund and Ignite about green computing, and yeah, the topic was really that. The point of view there was that we can clean up the generation, and of course that's a work more on the energy system, but from the computing side there's a lot of stuff you can do. You can improve algorithms of compression of computing, but you can also change the materials you use, and you can change the chips themselves for how the data center works. So there's optical computing, it's more about moving a lot of energy is just lost by moving information inside a data center, not doing any computing. Just because you need to move maybe one cluster is here and another racks of computing is here, and you need to move 20 meters and then you lose a lot of energy. So this kind of stuff that seems trivial is what a lot of the innovation is about. So if you can manage to use photonics, optical computing there, you can save maybe 50-80% of that energy. Or maybe you can use different chips that use in-memory computing. They not need to move the things. Or you can go to reversible, which is really, really, really far-fetched technology, very deep, like information theory stuff that is hard for most people to get their heads around. But there's like a lot that can be done, basically.
That's like the fusion energy.
Yeah, the fusion of computing. Yes, maybe yes. So we can define it like that.
So there are different ways then in which we may end up not blowing up the electricity.
Yeah, it's a lot also about will. Where are we gonna put most of the effort in developing, in scaling, in investing in these things? So if we want, there's a lot that can be done just on the computing side and not only the energy side. And anyway, like in the next, in this decade, up to 2030, most prediction, and prediction can be wrong, of course, see data center are only like 10% of the demand of the growth in demand in only electricity, not all energy. And actually, more than that is what's called here space cooling, and it's actually air conditioning mostly. So like, just the fact that people are less poor in India and China and that the world is hotter because of climate change, you couple these two, and that's inducing more demand of energy than data centers.
Wait, also, cooling takes more than heating.
No, this is only about new demand because the world is getting hotter, and usually this is about being also poor and not having air conditioning.
Poor countries also hotter generally.
Yes, exactly. So in India, we expect a huge growth in demand from air conditioning just because they have 30 degrees humid, and today they don't have because they don't yet have an air conditioner, but one day will have it, they will use it, So that's huge growth of demand. But it's also like vehicles going electric, or, things like steel making going electric, that's huge demand, than data centers. Still, it's challenging, is not negligible, but we have to understand that there's a lot of other drivers that are really big out there. So we have to put things into context. This doesn't mean you can just use AI for everything and blow up demand, but and
don't say thank you.
Exactly. Once they take over, it's better if you said thank you, even if it costs 1% more.
Okay.
But so then of course year today we focus more on the generation, and so a lot of this is gonna power by renewables and batteries and so on. But of course we are also debating other sources that maybe were forgotten for a while, like nuclear. So nuclear is it's getting a lot of traction in the venture capital startup space. Here, startup only raise equity because they're still too high risk to raise everything else usually. Maybe some grants, but not like you cannot go to a bank with nuclear yet, especially nuclear fusion, or also like very new stuff on other types. And we see both in Europe and the US. It's not new, like there was a lot of funding in 2021, 2022 already, but it's keeping up on both topics of fission is mostly small nuclear modular reactor and nuclear fusion, so at the different time frames, whatever. But of course, it's a topic of huge interest, and we are seeing, continued capital inflows, and it's quite some billions, summing up the two on both sides of the Atlantic. Still, the US invests 4 times more overall. It's a similar trend, but it's still the amount is much larger in the US. And yeah, so like, of course, what happened to nuclear is that what's of course commercial today is fission. So that's just to be of course clear. And we built a lot of that actually, many decades ago, like we were saying for France. Yeah. And it has a lot of great advantages. It's stable, it goes 24/7. It actually has almost no emissions, so on that side is great. It's super safe, despite what people fear. Of course, we had no serious accident, and less people die for that than for sure fossil fuel with all the pollution, a huge less fraction, like 100 times more, less or even more than fossil fuel, and even sometimes a bit less than renewable, but they're super safe, all of them. And it has its own, like if you have that and you have also the enrichment, usually that's the tricky part, having the fuel, but overall it's something that is pretty good for sovereignty supply chain. The problem is that it just costs a lot. And actually everything has been decreasing a lot, especially solar, wind, batteries recently, and nuclear has increased almost 50% since 2010. So that means like the technology has so far been stalling or failing in the deployment in the last decades. And of course, also time takes a lot of time to build this stuff. So when you want to change a system and it takes 10 years to build a plant, then for 10 years, you just have construction. You don't have new generation there.
But then how did they manage in 20 years to completely nuclearize France?
Yeah, it was a different moment politically and everything, and there was just a strong. Usually, nuclear is tricky also because on the fission side, especially, it's really works well where it's a clear mandate from the state. Yeah, because it's the typical stuff that it's very good doing it all the same, standardized, and big projects and very regulated and very complex. So it's stuff that if you have a clear vision and you work on that and you do all the reactors the same and you do all of it in time and people know how to do them, then it can work well. When you have different providers also like trying different stuff, or you have, maybe we are not building a lot of them in the last few decades, so there's no one that knows how to build them, or the regulators are not.
There's a knowledge gap.
So there's all of, and that's really tricky in nuclear because it's complex stuff. In solar, maybe we didn't know, but like you train a person in 1 month, they can install.
It's very low tech. Basically.
It's like the tech is decently high tech in producing them, but everything else is pretty straightforward, and it's modular, so you can do small or big is the same. It's really easy, while nuclear is a huge project, and where there's the law of big projects, that the biggest a project is, the harder it is to actually make it work well. There's a book about this, how big things get done, and nuclear and the Olympics are the worst stuff in the world. They are the two projects that are really because it's really complex and big stuff. And any small piece that goes wrong, then it compounds one on the other. And that's what's been happening. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. In the past, we did things decently fast. But a bit everywhere, it's been struggling to really make nuclear deployment work at the moment. And then the bets is from the startup side, that's been a lot about doing things like small modular reactors. So maybe taking this and making it small and more standardized modular. We need to see how it plays out. There's a lot of great companies working on that. There's not yet like something we can, fully see this has worked, And then new fusion is, of course, the big bet for the future. Like the joke is that fusion is always 30 years in the future.
It's almost like quantum supremacy
as
well.
It was 30 years in the future, 30 years ago, and like that's the joke.
They also said that about AI, though, I think, at some point. So,
I also feel like, AI for 10 years, there was nothing truly groundbreaking that people were saying, okay, this is changing everything, Like there was advancement in computer vision, there was things, but like for many years, people felt like it wasn't changing the world for them. And then something unlocked. So, you don't know when that moment is in technology often. At the moment, the leading startup in fusion plan to try to get something that actually produce energy, electricity in maybe the end of this decade. And that's the first things. So before, in the best case, I guess, before the end of the 30s, we are not going to have something meaningful that changes the energy system. So it's more like we are going to have to figure out most of the problem before them, like in cleaning up and, securing it. And then if we really solve the problem, maybe we can unleash like what they call it energy abundance, that you can stop thinking for some stuff about the energy cost, or you can do any process that makes sense. That's the future long-term.
Almost like a cheat code.
Yeah, it's like now with AI that you can just deploy it everywhere. Like you try to do that very fast and it gets in cheaper. So that kind of, you stop thinking about it. Yeah. That's the kind of.
What kind of things could we get with energy abundance?
Pretty much it changes completely how you think about things, I guess. Like today, especially in the boring stuff, like in industry or these kind of things, you think, this process takes a lot of energy, so we just cannot do it. Then you can do all of those processes, like you can take, and if recycling something takes a huge amount of energy, if you want, you can still do it, And then you everything that's reliant on that, it's as a main bottlenecks, then you can just do it. AI data center, then if you have cheap and totally clean energy, then there's not like a huge limit in building them.
No.
So that's like, but we are not there.
Grid will still be a problem, though, I guess.
Yes, it would be, unless you have it located in the same
exactly.
place.
If you can figure out a way of doing it like in a really modular way, really like putting the generation where the or where the demand is, then.
Yeah, that's what some data center want, to have their own nuclear and them the same place. So-called
power couples.
It has its own challenges, but it's mostly cost-wise, and time-wise. So I don't think they want to wait 5 or 10 years to get their energy. So they mostly want to have it today. So that's the problem there, I guess. And of course, on Dealroom you can find, startup categorized about these topics. So you can investigate who are these players, who they're raising from, and what kind of approaches they are taking to solve these problems.
What are the most promising fission and fusion startups in Europe?
In Europe, so there's actually a lot of them. So I hate to make names because then I always forget someone and someone can get angry. But there's recently Marvel Fusion is one of the latest to raise a big round in fusion in Europe. There's still in Germany there's Proxima, there's Renaissance Fusion, there's Novatron Fusion. There's a lot of startup working on fusion in Europe. There's actually around 50% of the venture back, the one that raise financing from venture capital, are in Europe. It's just that many of them are a bit smaller than some of the huge ones in the US. And in fission, there's a bit of different approaches. There's Horizon, there's Nucleo, there's a few others that they don't, the steady energy, Jimmy, they don't do all the same stuff. Some do small modular reactors, some do like recycling and reusage of the waste from nuclear. So there's a bit of differences in there. But yeah, there's still some momentum, and we are gonna see in the next coming few years which one get to the scale and actually deploy. Yeah, and another topic that's in the race, basically, because on one side we have solar, wind, and also battery that gone massively commercial, and it's like, especially when we talk about lithium and the established chemistry, those things are a bit out of the venture capital. No venture capital is gonna bet on like in wind manufacturers. Like that's a super consolidated market and so on. What the race has been about is, of course, getting something to complement this transition, and that's why some people like a lot nuclear or geothermal, because it's more like base load, what they call it, that is not changing during the day or from one month to the other. And geothermal is also a big focus at the moment, especially in the US. This makes total sense because the US has also a lot more resources that can be untapped in geothermal.
Is it already deployed, geothermal?
So geothermal, there's a few different kinds that we also have mapped here. Like what's here called, is not a bad word, but shallow geothermal means that you don't need to get too deep.
How deep?
We can be a few tens of meters or nothing crazy. And it's more like what's often coupled with heat pumps or
exactly,
those kind of things. And there's deployment of that is something totally. It's the problem with that is usually very dependent on location. So you have to have the right location where you have this ready for, especially for the application that are about also generating electricity, because it's easier to do a heat pump, and many of them are take the energy from the ground. That's fine, you can do it. But to do big plants, to do also electricity and so on, that's why there's a lot of work on the deep geothermal, which means getting really.
How deep is deep?
It can be several hundred meters and things like that, depending exactly. Some of them try, for instance, to use all the oil wells. That's why the US
sounds logical. Yeah,
they try to deploy inside those old wells. So they try to solve two problems. One, that maybe they are getting abandoned, and in theory you need to spend money to make it safe. Then that doesn't always happen, but still you have problems with those wells, and they want to reuse it for these purposes. And in general, there's of course there's knowledge in the ecosystem about drilling, about these kind of things a lot more, and they're reusing that knowledge, and that the same area that maybe had a lot of oil and gas production, they can maybe become some geothermal labs. So all to be seen. There's some interesting development. Companies like Fervo, Ivor in the US, they're like big names that they're showing some promising, let's say, development. We will see once they start to sell this. They have some offtake agreement. They have something. So it's growing. And then there's also the AI. Actually, there's quite some interesting cases in here in understanding where is a good point, exactly where. And so on. So that's a lot of also work that has been happening there. And so in general, that's been a pretty strong growing sector for venture capital, especially in those two last areas, the deep and the AI discovery of the where to do geothermal. That's been deploying. And it's still not like we have to see where geothermal gets as a kind of really power, enough to make a difference in the energy transition. But there's work on the innovation side.
But I believe this is one of the few, if not the only, VC funding chart in this presentation that actually shows growth up until like 2024.
But it's overall relatively small, I guess, 500 million.
It's still there's still a lot about tech development and doing the first trial. So then you need to scale.
Probably oil and gas companies are also investing in.
There's a lot of total. This is one of the sectors where there's actually like a good ground for cooperation
Yeah.
with
Mm-hmm.
oil and gas, together with the carbon capture space. So those are the topics where, of course, you interact with oil and gas a lot, from everything to technologies to deployment to you recycle, people with experience into these sectors. Yeah, and then of course that the other big topic is the grid.
That's good fun as well.
Every one of us has been reading as much as he could about Spain, and probably most of us don't have like the capacity to actually understand
I have zero
what
clue.
is synchronous inertia versus asynchronous inertia, or a frequency response and 50 Hz. Most people are not super familiar with that. And
Sounds like you understand it much better than we do.
Yeah.
I'm a mechanical engineer, but I'm still not an expert on this. So I prefer not to say, get too deep. But like, I just wanted to say that the grid in Europe is remarkably, in general, on average, really resilient. Like many countries like Germany, UK, France, and so on, they get like maybe 10 to 20 minutes per year that you don't have electricity on average, like for people. So while in the US, for instance, you get several hours per year. So it's, and people often react having some kind of generator or battery or whatever to try to bridge this. So in general, the grid in Europe is pretty resilient. And some people have in their mind that, since we are building more renewable oscillate in generation, this means that the grid is becoming less reliable. But like, if we take the example of Germany, the renewable grew from, like 14%, whatever, in 2006 to over 50% in 2023, for instance. But the downtime of the grid has been actually improving. So and there's many places in the world that are running grids almost 100% on of wind, solar, and batteries. Even Texas, or like some states in South Australia, or some places like this, and they're not having any outages. So it's not like per se. Of course, depending on what kind of grid you have, you need to have certain strategies in place. You need to have, it's a really complex business grid, but it doesn't mean you have more renewables than the grid fails.
There's no inherent connection between the two.
At the moment, we honestly don't know exactly what happened in Spain. The bottom line is that we need to work a lot on grid infrastructure. So there's like 1-2 trillion that they say there needs to be invested in the next 3 decades. Since I think we can say it's a pretty big amount of money, but it's not like unprecedented. Europe spent like 600 billion in only 1 year importing fossil fuel. And that's money you just spend, and it's over. The next year you need to re-spend them. So while the grid, at least, it lasts decades. So, we need to do this, and it's in 3 decades, and we need to do it anyway because the grid is getting pretty old. Most of it is 40 years old.
Right.
So it's, it's like an house. You need to sometimes redo it. And we also need to expand it, of course. So there's work to be done. And the fact that you electrify things, you do renewables, means you have to do more work on the grid for sure. But it's a huge opportunity for innovation in many ways. So what is called like the flexibility services.
What is it?
It's like, can be both demand or generation, but it's like, can you move things in time? For instance, can you, charge your car at a different moment? Can you run this process that is very energy demanding in another moments? Can you trade energy between one place and the other? So these kind of things, and it's where a lot of digital tech is also actually there.
So it's not per se demand or generation, but it's more like balancing.
It's everything around that. It's also a lot about batteries, but it's how you aggregate these things. So you aggregate, thousands of houses, you aggregate thousands of vehicles, and then you manage this to make sure that the grid runs better. So this is it's a huge market that is being created. And of course, it's a market where startups are doing a lot of work, especially in Europe, where this sector is more advanced. So we mapped this across many sectors, and there's there's things that are more software, things are more hardware. There's, just algorithm to predict how much is going to be generated or to optimize our batteries, interact with the grid. There are things to just, of course, monitor what's happening in the grid so that if there's a problem, if there's some imbalance, you can, also manage this grid a lot more smartly. And there's a lot of also happening in the consumer and industrial side. So there's a lot of these challenger supplier or supplier of equipment for houses and so on. So things like Octopus Energy in the UK, which is like a new style of supplier of energy. So you just get a subscription with them for the energy. But then what they try to do is to manage your house for you in some things. So if you let them manage your charging of your car in certain moments, then you can maybe charge for free, because then they can use these things to balance the grid or to put things in the grid when it's cheaper and these kind of things. And the same you can do with your, electric heating, or usually everything that is being electrified is very easy to manage digitally and smartly. So you build an ecosystem of services on top of this. And this is a huge area for startup activity, been oscillating in the years, but it's still, it's over 8 billion in the last 5 years when we take it a broad definition of the space.
Mining.
It's an area that it's tangential to energy, but it's of course mostly related to the battery space and everything. But that's a sector that maybe doesn't strike as the most high-tech to people. But there's actually a lot going on. And the main areas of innovation is actually related, some of them related to AI. How do we discover new reserves of minerals? Some of them because maybe we had never looked for that mineral a lot in the past, because it's stuff that we need more now, like lithium. Or maybe it's just because we didn't know that certain reserves were there. And so there's a lot of innovation in AI, mixing different stuff, mixing sensor, mixing drilling, mixing satellite imaging, mixing modeling from geophysics and so on, to find where these resources are. And then there's of course some topics that because of the evolution of which minerals would we actually need now. So of course lithium is a huge focus. There's a lot of startups that have been working on lithium mining, especially what is called direct lithium extraction processes. But there's also some very far-fetched stuff that actually work, but for people maybe it's hard to get their hand around, but like using biotechnology to actually mine. So using microbes or using other processes like that you can either take the waste that are out of a mine, like the tails, usually that's very polluting stuff you don't know what to do about, and maybe you can kind of clean and recycle this and extract some mineral from there. Or maybe you can get to, usually in mines they're like, if the concentration of the mineral is below a certain percentage, it's not effective to actually mine it, so you throw all that away. But if you have processes that are better, and many startups are working on that, then you can use also all this discarded stuff. And this is a topic, for instance, it's funny to distinguish between what we mine for centuries or thousands of years and what's new. So lithium, many people say, oh, we don't have enough lithium, but lithium until 10 years ago, no one cared about. Like we never used lithium in the history of humanity. So we don't know where lithium is. We now start to know, and every day we find more. Okay. And of course, it's still challenging from an environmental perspective. It takes time to build new mines, but there's a lot more lithium that we thought 10 years ago.
Because we actually started this conversation about energy independence.
So
now we're kind of back to square one with batteries. We didn't talk about like solid state batteries. Do they also use lithium? Or?
So solid state is more for the transportation side.
Okay, not for storage.
Because the main advantage of solid state is more like having an higher, energy density. So that's more important for moving application. Some of them are often based on lithium. So it's not really about changing the dependency on lithium. Okay. So the big trend has been actually to remove any other mineral apart from
Lithium.
so cobalt and those kind of things.
Yeah.
So what is now the chemistry that getting more traction in the
LFP.
LFP from really pushed by China. And those are actually, even a slightly bit more of lithium, but it's only lithium, the main valuable stuff in there. And then for like supply chain diversification or risk or everything, there's of course a lot of attention to sodium because sodium is super abundant and cheap and everything.
Right.
So, and that's still mostly it's being deployed at the initial stage also in cars, but it's also looked upon a lot for stationary, because stationary you have less requirement of performances. You have usually the space. It's more about cost and safety and operating temperature, other parameters, but still fine with that. And then there's other chemistries being developed for like stationary. So there's iron, metal things. There's a lot of innovation on.
Yeah, there is a Dutch startup that actually stores energy in iron. Yeah.
Yes, there's both, like some is thermal storage, so you kind of store as a chemical reaction or as thermal in like molten salt or in other things, and then you kind of re-give this heat back. So that's one side, and then there's like more electrochemical storage.
I think it was this. Yeah, I need to look up the name. Yeah.
There's the Saltits was one, but I know there's some doing long-term storage. There's also Elestor in the Netherlands that do more like redox flow batteries and these kind of things. Still, like there's a lot of development in here. Still, the moment the deployment is dominated by lithium, and we need to see.
Is there lithium in Europe?
There is in some places. They found quite a bit in some areas in the Balkans, but we are not blessed with lithium in general. Like most of the lithium is in Australia and in South America, but that's still it's historical. We didn't have most of the minerals in Europe, also rare earths. We miss a lot of those stuff, but if you have good relationship and diversified supply, that still can work. So the point is building up this relation and this supply from the different countries.
Exactly.
The most tricky part is that China actually doesn't have a lot of mining of lithium, but they have all the refining and processing, and they have all the agreements, and they've been investing 10, 20 years into the mines and into these countries to make sure that the supply goes to them. So it's more there that the work has been going on. This is an area that a lot of it is happening, and one interesting mineral actually is, and it's something that we use every day, is copper. And that's actually where the history of humanity has a weight, because we use copper from like the origin of like recent history, and that means that we got a lot of the easy copper. So like we already mined most of the super easy one because we have been searching for it.
So we're running out of copper, you mean? Or
so
it's getting harder to get.
I don't want to ever say things like that, because every time you think you're running out of one,
there's
you discover
innovation
something. But for sure, there's a lot of work around how can we get copper that is more hard to get, so lower percentage or things like that. So there's many startups working on this in different approaches, and that's more like the topic. Because copper has been mined for a lot, while lithium is a new stuff, so it's mostly developing the process and actually building and finding the reserves and these kind of things. While in copper, you have this problem that we used it for 2,000, 3,000 years. So that even if we were less and using it less, it makes an impact on what the system you have today.
No,
that makes sense.
I don't know what we were using it for, but
tools.
Yeah, everything. Tools, like even cooking stuff or like things. No, copper has been used since the dawn of humanity. And then we use it, of course, for the grid. That's
all the wires.
So, and for everything. So a lot of it is in use, and we need a lot more, of course, for grid also. So it's not just about motors or batteries. It's more about the grid infrastructure, like where do we find all this copper, and that's where a lot of work is going around.
Yeah. What else do we got?
Oh, the green.
Green molecules. What is that?
Yeah, it's a umbrella terminology that I think most people don't really hear. But it's putting together hydrogen, synthetic fuels, biofuel. It's about everything that we use today in a form of more of a fuel, and that today is all fossil fuels, oil, gas, and so on. And it's mostly about whatever we cannot, or maybe, for economic, technical reason, it's a bit harder to electrify. Can we substitute with molecules that are like carbon, neutral, or not based on fossil fuels? So that's like a huge, of course, also area of innovation. A lot of attention has been going into hydrogen, the production, electrolyzer, green hydrogen production, and some things like synthetic fuels. It's a personal market that I'm always a bit torn, because we focus, the ecosystem has been focusing a lot on the wrong use cases a bit in the past. We're trying to push some of this for transportation, and there's still some lobbying around that, while the market seems pretty clearly, saying that hydrogen is not, but it's like it usually say that hydrogen is a squared wheel. It's totally not fit for purpose to do anything around that. While there are many other things we need
for storing energy, maybe.
That's something that is being thought about. At the moment, is not really happening because of many reasons.
Batteries are better, maybe.
Batteries are better for sure for the short term. We will be talking about long term. At the moment, there's not really a lot of long term storage deployed, because we still have that in the form of gas and hydro, and these kind of things are the long term storage. But in the long term, we're gonna need some long term storage. How much of it is not clear, and maybe hydrogen is one of the way. The problem is that it costs a lot. You lose 50%, to make. So you lose a lot on it, and it's the rationale that some people have been putting out is but renewable, sometimes you don't know what to do with the energy that they create. And so maybe we can do hydrogen, and then whatever we use this hydrogen for is better than wasting energy, But in practice, this is not really working on happening on the most part, because it costs a lot of equipment to make hydrogen and other things like this. So
even
when
with
you
this
build
excessive...
you don't want to use it 5% of the time when you are not going to do something else with it. So as much as for still some time, most of the electricity we generate, we want to use it in stuff that are more efficient. But long term, we need for sure some of it. How much in which use cases is a huge debate that people are having. But for instance, in aviation, it's one area where people are saying maybe we need synthetic fuels made from hydrogen or things like that. The problem is that it's very costly, and so the adoption is still not there yet. So it's a market where there's a lot of startup developing the tech, and we are gonna see what happens in the next time.
And the funding is definitely there.
The funding is there. I excluded here stuff like vehicles, because it's a market that boomed before and crashed down. But it's not repeating itself. But this stuff is what was being worked at the moment, and we are gonna see how it plays out in the next few years. One statistic that recently came out is that only 6% of the plants that are producing hydrogen today have a buyer. So most of it is there's not yet the market adoption because this is costly, and why should I do it? There's a bit of that problem, and the market is still a bit figuring it out. So it's more stimulating a bit of adoption to develop the tech and be ready when we need really to roll out some of this stuff more widely.
Right.
So that's the logic that's been applied, but it's a tricky one.
When do you think commercial airlines will fly on something else than kerosene?
I think when they will be forced to.
Or when it becomes more economical. Well,
I don't think that's gonna happen very soon.
But also not the largest plane, not the larger planes, I suppose. Like the hydrogen planes right now, for example, are only the smaller ones.
Yeah, so
it's
electric
really
and hydrogen aviation, they are starting from smaller planes, more regional or
exactly.
short, medium
like
distance.
Very local, in fact.
But like synthetic fuels or biofuels, synthetic fuels are the one with actual hydrogen. You can use it in every airplane a bit, like most of them will be compatible or some of them are compatible already today, up to 100% of using this. So
but the price?
The price is the problem. And it's not like just the price, it's like how do you produce this? So like e-fuels requires a lot of electricity that you can use for other stuff today, and it's limited the amount of electricity we have. So there's not really like the capacity to build enough to power even a fraction of aviation today. So it's more like long term, if we unleash, energy abundance, clean energy, then it can make sense to maybe do this stuff. So we will see what happens. At the moment, there's a bit of stimulated or, visionary adoption from some airlines or some mandates from governments to create a bit of the market. So to say you have to use 2%, 1% of, these sustainable fuels, alternative fuels, let's call them, so that, you develop a bit the market. But it's not going to make a dent in the next decade or so on. So we will see what happens. Aviation is still a very open market. My feeling is that at a certain point, either we go very fast on innovation that we get really this, supply that is much cheaper, or we get a really strong pressure on the airlines to do something, because at the moment it's a big technological problem. So, but at the moment the point is that the market is mostly saying, there's no easy fit, so we just go on like we are, and which is for now still working. We have to see how much they will have buy-in to do this. Let's say once there's really most of the other sectors start to transition, and aviation is really one that is properly called hard to abate sector, hard to transition sector. But at a certain point they will say, okay, you didn't do anything so far, which is a bit true. Like Airbus, for instance, was developing this program on hydrogen airplanes, and then they just, let it go. Maybe hydrogen is not the right solution for aviation. Many people say that, and maybe they're right, but they're not even betting, a lot on electric airplanes. They're just saying, we have a lot of demand for the planes we do now, so we don't feel the need to do anything else, maybe. Yeah. So that's like what's happening, and we will have to see where the market goes. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I guess this is where we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah.
At this point, we've been talking for quite a while, and it's a very big topic, and we probably will need to come back to this table at some point to talk more. But for now, Yoram, Lorenzo, thank you so much for the conversation, and until next time.